One of the muscles on your back that I think many people are confused about in terms of how to actually train it and what it actually does is the rhomboid group, okay? And the rhomboids, which many of you have probably heard someone say rhomboids before, they're kind of in the upper middle of the back, right? So if you picture, this is a spine, okay? This is the lower sort of portions of the spine, we'll imagine. This is like the middle portion, and this is the neck. The scapula, the shoulder blade, sits kind of like right here, okay? And just to sort of depict the rhomboids and what they do first before we figure out how do we train this thing, we need to understand where their fibers are and what the direction of those fibers are actually doing. So if you picture the scapula here, the rhomboids basically attach to this inner border of the scapula, and they run at an upward angle. Okay, and so when I hold the scapula in this position and we think about, okay, what would fibers that are attaching all along this inner border that are running upward do? Well, the first and most obvious thing is that they would pull the scapula inward toward the spine this way, right? Point A to point B, shortens, bada bing, bada boom. But what else do they do? Many of you may also see this intuitively. They also tip the shoulder blade like this, okay? And this is known as downward rotation. Why? Well, because if the scapula is sitting like this, the shoulder blade, this would be tipping downward and this would be tipping upward. You can think about it like, okay, here's the shoulder socket. Is it moving toward the floor in this instance, or is it moving toward the sky? And what the rhomboids do is they move this shoulder socket toward the floor as they contract. Can you all see that? Hopefully you can. Right, so they're doing a combination really of those two things. In other words, they're not just tipping downward like this, but they're also tipping downward as they pull the shoulder blade upward. And a really cool part about this is that if you picture the shoulder blade moves positions, right, you can picture how these fibers would sort of bend and stay along this border of the shoulder blade. And so in something like a pull down, let's say, they're going to be really powerful downward rotators. They're not just this retraction type muscle. And I think that's where a lot of the confusion is, which is that people see, you know, point A to point B, and they just assume that this is the only thing that the rhomboids do. But in reality, a vast majority of retraction, right, moving the shoulder blades back in a lot of instances, relates a lot to the middle traps and the rhomboids together. And so if we're to try to target this mid-back group to its greatest extent, the rhomboids specifically, what we need to consider is what kinds of motions would isolate it more relative to something like a row, right? Because again, in a row, you have a lot of trap involvement. And so how can we basically make it so that this is going to be the prime mover? Well, I've done a video on a muscle called the Teres major before, and I'll just very briefly describe this. And this will be really important for actually understanding how we can train the rhomboids, because the Teres major, which is basically a muscle that if you picture, again, the shoulder blade sits here, and just imagine that the upper arm is here. Actually, I could probably hold the two if I can pull this off. There we go. The Teres major runs like this, okay? And what you'll notice, hopefully you can see that, is that when this Teres major contracts, it basically pulls the arm inward like this, right? So when the arm goes up like this teres will lengthen. And what you will notice, this is so cool, is that this string of muscle, right, if I just put my shoulder blade here, is basically one continuous string. And that's not so coincidental, right? If any of you have ever seen the obliques, the internal and the external obliques, and the way that they link and they interdigitize, they're basically just one super long muscle that goes all the way across your trunk in either direction. And I kind of think about these two tissues the same way. So practically speaking, what the hell does this mean? Well, that means whenever this thing is contracting, right, it's going to pull, if you imagine these 2 points, again, upper arm is here, it's going to pull this point in this direction, right? But what is on the other side of this joint to be able to stabilize that and to be able to manage that regardless of where exactly this shoulder blade is? Well, these rhomboids right here. So now it becomes a question of not just how do we isolate this, but how do we isolate this string? And if there were such a way to sort of create an isolation of these tissues, it would be in something like a straight arm pullover motion, right? So these are motions basically where your arm is above your head, but where the load direction is not pulling you upward like a pull down, it's actually pulling your arm sort of upward and across your head this way and pulling down against that direction. You can do that with a single arm, you can do that with two arms. And the other thing to consider here is that although that might be the most specific option, just your normal pull down where your arms are sort of a little bit maybe wider out to the sides, where you're focusing more just on motion of these two bones, you know, the forearm and the upper arm, as opposed to moving the entire shoulder girdle. But also keep in mind that any pull down motion specifically that's maybe a little bit wider, right, from from here to about here, these are going to be motions that are also very specific to this string. Why? Well, because if you imagine the top of a pull down like this, right? So here's the top of the pull down like this, my arm is up here, my shoulder blade and arm need to rotate this way. And to pull my arm and my whole shoulder blade down, can you all see how this string of muscle is basically just contributing to moving that and creating that whole motion, right? So any kind of pull down based motion and any kind of pull over based motion, those are going to be two really fantastic and specific options to targeting the rhomboid specifically. And remember that it's not that the rhomboids don't contribute to something like a row, because again, they obviously pull the shoulder blade this way, but the relative amount of rhomboid involvement in that instance is lower because the traps can contribute to a row or something like a shrug row. However, in a pull down or in something like a pull over, the traps are basically radio silent. Of course, they have to contract to some degree to maintain the position of this bone to make sure it doesn't fly off the body. But in a pull down or in a pull over motion, what the resistance is asking of the body from a contraction standpoint is basically has nothing to do with the traps, right? Because if you're pulling your arm down, as I mentioned earlier, your shoulder blade has to rotate down, right? But all your traps actually pull your shoulder blade upward. So any kind of pull down, any kind of pull over motion, whether it's slightly in front of your body or to the sides, those are going to be great options to target the rhomboids. And to target the rhomboids, again, we really need to isolate for the strand called the teres major.